Good afternoon and welcome to CenComm Connect Forum for Dialogue, presented by the Center for Management Communication, IIM Bangalore. Today's webinar is presented to you by Divya Sethi. Divya heads the Global Leadership Development in the Corporate IT Group at Intel. In this capacity, she works with Intel's CIO and her staff to drive the Global Leadership Development Charter. Prior to this, she was the Executive Development Consultant for more than Asia. In 2010, she was selected as one of the top 10 young trainers across the world. Earlier, she has worked with Intel's India CEO to define Intel India Organizational Development Strategy, which subsequently received awards from American Society for Training and Development and Corporate University Exchange. Divya has over 20 years of experience of executive development, psychometrics, and CXO coaching experience across technology companies. She has developed courses leveraging cognitive neurosciences and biofeedback measurements to improve the performance of senior leaders. She studied instructional design at UC Berkeley and is professionally certified executive coach from New Ventures West and Neuro Leadership Institute. We are very privileged to have Divya with us today, and I would now request Divya to take this webinar forward.
Hey, thanks, Anushi. It's quite a delight to be here and share the virtual medium with everyone that's online. Even though we can't see each other, we are connected deeply with each other, so welcome. Thank you for spending a precious 1 hour of a Friday afternoon from your busy schedules for this. The topic of feedback to feed forward, for those of us, for all of us actually, relationships that we are part of, the conversations we drive, whether it's influencing, whether it's bringing people along. There is a piece of feedback that comes up every now and then. And interestingly, sometimes we hear at the end of a meeting of, hey, your presentation was great, but, and then you can fill in your blanks, or hey, good job. And sometimes we wonder, what does one do with that input, right? It's provided, and we don't know what to do with it. So that's the hope for today, that with the conversation that we are going to be a part of, that you derive some nuggets of how can we use this tool of feedback to really feed something forward, to do something, improve something, and so on. So 2 days back, the 18th of July, was a very important day for Intel. We completed 50 years as a company. And interestingly, our CIO, the Chief Information Officer, was visiting us from Santa Clara. I work with her pretty closely from a leadership angle. And, as you can imagine, when you have a senior leader, folks would be in conversations, presentations, ops reviews, the whole 9 yards. And there was someone, who presented to her, and right after that, she came out and reached out to me that, hey, Divya, do you have a minute? And I said, yeah, tell me. And so she said, I presented to Paula, and my manager at the end of the meeting said, you need to really work on your confidence, need to do something about it. And she said, I'm lost. I don't know what to do with that. So that's one version, and, each of you can fill in your blanks of where you may have encountered that version. There is another version, which is something like this. Ravi is John's manager. Ravi's on the left. Ravi says, hey, I wanted to give you feedback on the meeting. Can you come to my room? And so John, obviously, starts thinking of the worst of, gosh, I don't know what's going to happen. And then Ravi says, that wasn't an effective meeting. Next time, need to do better. And John, of course, says, sure. not knowing what is he going to do differently. Let's fast forward into maybe another situation, maybe which rings something home, which is, John, your team was completely unprofessional in that meeting. What happened? And John, whether you can see him or mentally, he's scratching his head of, what does that mean? Completely unprofessional. I don't know what to do with it. And to keep adding color, you could find this is that time of the year. Half year has passed by. We're in the 7th month, and so there could be like a feedback conversation where Ravi is essentially saying, maybe with or without the previous conversations, the growth areas that you need to work on, need to improve in presentations, need to be more confident in meetings. So you get, we all encounter maybe some of this or all of this, and it does leave us with a pinch of salt as to what does one do with some of these things when we hear the input, the feedback. So what we'll do over the next 40-ish minutes or so is really talk through 3 things. One is, what is this dilemma of feedback, right? I mean, there is a lot of research that points to some of the goodness, and so what is the dilemma? And then what makes feedback hard? I mean, why is it that whenever we hear someone wants to give us feedback, we do feel a surge of heartbeat and a surge of blood, if you will, of gosh, I don't know what's going to happen. So what makes it hard? And the last piece is really about how can we leverage this as a tool to really make changes, make improvements, make enhancements to whatever work that we all do. So, let's start with a study that Google led. Google is a company we all admire. They did this Project Oxygen where they interviewed 10,000 managers. And what they did was, interestingly, they were trying to sort of have a science of management, right? What really does a good manager do? And they looked at performance reviews, they looked at employee engagement surveys. What do people value in a good manager? And one of the things that came up is providing specific and constructive feedback, balancing both negative and positive. So interestingly, they were anticipating things which were, sort of like the technical skills or something, on the side of that. And, this was one of the big things of, providing that constructive feedback. And this is a tool, if you look at, for the longest time, most companies, I mean, whichever field you're part of, it doesn't matter the field, this is a tool that is being used today, right? And it is a tool that works for, is being used as a way to, get work done, as an intervention that managers use. So it's something that is largely prevalent, right? The data varies, but, most companies use this in one way or the other. And interestingly, let's look at another facet of this, where we find that this research, let's move to the next slide, is, we want to know how we are doing. So let's take a minute to look at the left side, the graphic that we have. So this was a study that was published in 2014, and Zenger and Folkman published this research. They had looked at about 900, population, and half of which were in the US, half were present elsewhere. So let's start from the left side, right, the 2-bar graphs. Giving positive feedback or giving negative feedback. Well, giving negative feedback is clearly harder for people, and giving positive feedback is somewhat easy. But if you look at the right-hand side, we all like to receive feedback. In fact, we all like to receive negative feedback. And there's a caveat that the responders added as they were being interviewed by Zenger and Folkman on the right, which is 92% of the respondents said they agreed with the assertion that feedback, whether it's the redirecting, whether it's corrective, whatever name we want to give, if delivered appropriately, is effective at improving performance. So at some level, we do want feedback, and it does improve performance. But then there is this caveat of if delivered appropriately that comes up. And we've seen that in the examples of when someone says you need to be more confident, you don't know what to do with that feedback. And Kevin Ochsner points this out very beautifully. He says that he's a neuroscientist from Columbia and has done a lot of research in the field of cognitive neurosciences. And interestingly, he said people who receive feedback only apply 30% of it. So, on one side, Google looked at Project Oxygen, found that this is a key intervention that managers could use. And then we have research that most organizations, whether it's research institutions, whether it's the academia, whether it's the corporations, this is a key way of conducting ourselves, use this. And fundamentally, we all want to know how we are doing based on the research from Zenger and Folkman. But there is something that gets in the way, right? There is something that causes us to apply it only 30% of the time. So let's, pick your own example of, a situation where someone said, hey, I want to give you feedback, or can I tell you something? Really what starts happening is we become something like this. We picture ourselves pacing up and down in sort of a doghouse. I mean, if you pictured someone like that, where, we're really pacing up and down, really worried. Sometimes we even go flashback as to what did I say like last week? Or what were the emails that I shared? Is there something that I can pick from there? How can I prepare myself before I go into this conversation, right? Does it sound familiar? In some way where someone says, I'd like to give you feedback, we are really going back into time as to what is it that they're going to say, and can I prepare my defense? Can I be ready for, why I did what I did? So we kind of, are preparing ourselves for the worst, and really it's imagining like footsteps in the dark, right? We're sort of, tensing ourselves when something like that happens. So really, that's the dilemma, right? On one side, we feel that it's something that's useful, we want to, it's the basis of how we improve. And then on the other side, it's hard. I mean, it does put us in a frenzy of anticipation of what's going to come by. So really, what makes feedback hard? Let's try to unpack this question of why is it hard? What happens in us when someone is giving feedback? So let's go back. I mean, let's go back to the fundamentals of what can we learn from the way we are wired so far as the feedback. What really happens in us that causes us to really, expect the worst, right? What happens? So if we were to examine our brain, right, and there are three parts largely, and there's the cortex and the neocortex. So let's try to look at it one at a time. There is the reptilian brain, right, which is really the brain that served us for centuries when we were, hunters and gatherers in the jungles, really fending for ourselves. This was the instinct that allowed us to really anticipate if there was, some kind of an animal attack or something is going to happen. Maybe we prevent people then moved their places of residence or places of where they were living inside the jungle to safer places, that kind of thing. So it's instinctual. It's like when you're, let's say, drawing money from an ATM and you feel that there is something suspicious going on. It's that kind of an instinct. So that's really our reptilian brain. The limbic is this aspect of emotions, right, where we draw connections and we have some kind of a community piece with each other and so forth, right? And the other piece is that of the cortex, right, of the thinking brain. This brain is what we use in order to problem solve, in order to make decisions, in order to take in new things. So now let's translate this in the context of feedback and what happens in our brain when we are in this process of receiving that feedback, right? So transporting ourselves here, this is our brain. There's the limbic system, there's the cortex. The cortex, like we looked previously, is the place where, which is the thinking brain. And the limbic system is where the emotions come up. And this is the way we have our normal breathing, it's all good. And then there is a piece that starts to happen, which is, interestingly, the primary way our brain is organized is to minimize threats and maximize rewards. So every 5 seconds, our brain is really scanning for, is there a threat in the environment? So, going back to the meeting, right, or where someone is presenting, our brain is really looking for who's making eye contact, is this person who's going to provide the funding, what are they doing? Am I getting nodding approvals or am I getting sort of a blank look? We are looking to gather feedback in the environment. Now, what happens is that the place where when there is someone giving us negative feedback, the moment it becomes something around, they are telling us that something didn't go okay, and we feel it's an evaluation, automatically our threat symptoms and our threat mechanisms in our brain launch, and we perceive a threat, we get emotional about it, and the way it affects us is we get into a flight or fight mode. So we go back to the dog that was there and we start pacing up and down as to what's going to happen, and our stress levels go up. And interestingly, in that moment, whether it's a tiger or a feedback, we have the same response. So it doesn't matter if you have something as massive as a tiger, or someone giving us feedback, has the same thing. But so really the question then is, how do we access our cortex? How do we use this feedback? So let's go back. Let's look at an example of how some people have used this. So I'm transporting us to the Orange County in California. Picture this. It's a beautiful area. It's a beautiful locality, and this is way back in 2003. Where 170,000 residents of a locality got together to really brainstorm of how do they prevent accidents from happening in their neighborhood. So what used to happen is, imagine children are going in the morning, going to school, and at that very time you have speeding cars. And they had accidents for pedestrians, for cyclists, for people who were dropping kids, and it used to result into really tragic situations. And they had tried everything. They had tried giving people more tickets, more speeding tickets, having more policemen around, but nothing happened. It just didn't happen. So they all got together, the 170,000 people, and said, hey, how do we prevent this? What is the feedback mechanism we can use in order to prevent something like this? And you'll be surprised with the solution they came up with. It was so simple that one would miss it, and it was so powerful that it changed the behavior. What they did, as they were trying to unpack this solution, figuring out how do they resolve it, they came up with this. They put the speed limit, and they also gave a mechanism of giving people real-time input of what is the speed right now. We have these radars. I'm sure you've seen these radars. And what it did, interestingly, is drivers slowed down at an average of 14%. In fact, 3 schools, had reported a speed dip from the average rate or, of the 20 speed limit. So what they did was they looked at just two simple pieces of feedback. They looked at providing something relevant. As the person is driving, they know their speed. It's relevant and it's actionable. So if they slow down, they can get immediate feedback as to what is their speed. So that's something to mull around of, what if we were picking up some things of feedback from this example? Let's look at another story. Let's look at the world of basketball, right? John Wooden, it's way before our times, is in the 1970s, was one of the best basketball coaches, and he used to work with UCLA. So here's John Wooden. This is halftime. This is the game in 1972. UCLA is trailing behind Florida State, and they aren't doing well. They really need to catch up the scores. And here he is talking to the star player, Bill Watson, of what he wants to do. And here's what he said: Bill, at the 10th minute in the game, I saw you pass into the basket from your head upwards. What I want to do right after this halftime is pass from your chest. And, wonderfully enough, they won that game. They actually came across, as stellar players right after that game. And 2 things his players still talk about. In fact, he passed away at the age of 99, but people, that were there at that time, said 2 things about him. One, that adults learn best when they're caught in action. So he used to take meticulous notes saying that, hey, at the 10th minute, I saw you passing this way, pass it in this other way. And the second thing he used to do was he didn't use this aspect about good job or need to do better. There was more information that he provided as input, as feedback to his players. So what does this have to do with feedback, right? What can we learn from it? First, from the previous example, if it is timely and relevant data and something that we can actionize, we actually can do something about it. And secondly, it's more than an evaluation. It is more around what can we do? What is specifically the action we can take? So moving us now to really this aspect about how do we then leverage this tool, right? We started out with what's the dilemma? It's a good tool. We can do something, we can leverage it for our benefit. We also unpacked this piece around feedback so far as our brain, and there is a certain threat component associated with feedback. And how do we go about minimizing the threat so that all of us can leverage this input and use it in order to feed it forward and really move towards the future? So what can we do? It's very simple. We could do 3 things. First, we look at feedback that's immediate, right? There's a lot of research that talks about the imperfect memory syndrome. And so imperfect memory, very simply, is if I was to share feedback today about, let's say, this conversation, it's going to have a recency effect. I'll remember more. Now, if I was to share this a week from now, the brain has the ability to fill in the details. So, we start losing the details if we don't notice things in the moment. It's like John Wooden really taking the time to make notes of, hey, at the 10th minute, you did this. Or in the presentation that was made to the chief information officer, someone saying, hey, at the 15th slide, I saw you were not making eye contact. That was a critical moment in the conversation. Next time, consider making eye contact. It's different from saying you need to be more confident to actually saying, here's the specific thing, make more eye contact, and that will take you to an effective presentation. So it's immediate. The second thing is specific. The story goes about, again, John Wooden, that he wouldn't use more than 10 words for a feedback. Pass from the chest instead of passing over the head, somewhere around 10 words. And thirdly, actionable. It needs to be action-oriented. What can we do differently? So one of my colleagues, his son goes to the Imtiaz Ali Academy, the cricket academy, and he went for his son's game, came right back from it and said, well, there's an interesting thing that happened. I said, what happened? So he said, well, I was cheering my son along from the stands, and he said, and I was telling him, son, believe in yourself, come on, you can do it. And he said that at the end of the game, he came and told me, Dad, that's great, but tell me what I can do differently instead of saying, believe in yourself. So can you be more specific? So, looking at the action piece of it, right? So these are the elements that really, make it something that we can feed forward, something we can engage with and do something about. So the question arises as to why it works, right? There is a piece around what Professor Bandura, from Stanford says, and there's a lot of work he's done on this, the aspect of social motivation. If people are proactive and aspiring, right, and we succeed when we have some sense of where we stand and how to make progress. And so fundamentally, we all want to improve, and fundamentally, we all aspire to do good things. And if only we know where we stand, which is possible through that data, which is immediate and specific, and then how to make progress comes from the action. So if we combine all these elements, we actually, have immense potential, immense power to do wonderful things, right? And so let's go back to this aspect of that the conversation we started out with, right? Going back to Ravi and John, right? So here we are. Ravi says, hey, John, I wanted to give you feedback on the meeting. Can we meet in our room? Clearly, there's something he can do better so far as creating the context for this conversation, which we'll see in a bit in the next slide. But look at how he reframes his conversation. So instead of saying, hey, you were not confident, or next time need to do better in a meeting, what he says is, I noticed you were reading from the slides and didn't make eye contact. So there wasn't time for a discussion. Next time, maybe you plan for 40 minutes of presentation. So assuming they met right around the time the meeting happened, it was immediate. So, John would have a good amount of memory around the conversation, as much as Ravi did. As well as, Ravi gave him feedback, which was more specific, right? More, you can think about it, imagine it, and do something about it. And there's also a piece around what can you do differently. So there is a snapshot, and then here's what you can do. Now, like Maya Angelou says, right, we may forget what people say to us, but we never forget how they made us feel. So really, the three elements of immediate, specific, and actionable, there is a piece around how do we go about saying it, right, which plays an equal amount or equal part in that feedback conversation. So let's try it again. Let's see what we can do differently. Hey, John, I wanted to offer feedback on the meeting. Is this a good time? I think if you go beyond the semantics, what it is doing is providing some opportunity for choice for Ravi. Maybe he wants to reflect on the presentation himself. Maybe he wants to, think about how this presentation went, or maybe he wants to listen into that feedback right away. So opening it, and again, saying it with the intention of really, I'm on your side and I want to help you improve, or really, I want to point things that went wrong. So what is our starting point in that feedback really allows us to feed it forward. If we are coming from a place of, well-intentioned feedback, it goes a long way in the receptivity of it. And so let's look at what he says next. Hey, as you opened the presentation, you read through the content versus engaging. What do you think happened? Now, in the case of a tenured person, the case of a person that perhaps you're with who's experienced, maybe you want to engage in self-reflection. What do you think went? And here, right here, John says, I think I got focused on the content and lost track of time and really then wanted to go through the content, right? It happens to us, right? When we know that there is a presentation, sometimes we are more concerned about going through the content versus creating time for dialogue. So that's a cool reflection that comes. So how would you like to handle it the next time? So he says, maybe I'll include my goal so I can remind myself at the start of what I want to do and how I want to create a dialogue. And that'll go a long way in just reminding himself of how he can do a better job. Another thing, now here's where he wears the John Wooden hat. Another thing you could do differently is have 10 slides instead of 20 slides and keep time for discussion, right? So if you look at, the previous conversation of someone saying you need to be more confident in meetings or need to be more confident in presentations. The flavor that we have is if it is immediate, if it is anchored in specifics, you spend more time reading versus engaging, right? And it's action-oriented. There was something that Ravi came up with himself, and there was something that John provided as input. Makes way for a conversation that, potentially John is going to use for future, where, he has more actionable things that he could do differently, and that feedback becomes something that he could use to improve. And, in the way it's delivered, it's perhaps reduce that threat response. Now, you would say, well, this is all the aspect about giving feedback, right? And what happens to this aspect about receiving feedback? And I would actually say that it's similar, right? It's the same. So let's say, I had a situation yesterday where my manager was giving me feedback on this aspect about, hey, your presentation, Divya, I think you need to be more consistent with standards. And I took 30 seconds to listen to what she was saying. And then I said, well, can you be more specific about which slide you're referring to? And so we went into a dialogue of which slide is she referring to that she's saying I need to be more consistent, and what's the standard, and we unpacked it. So I think it's incumbent as a receiver as well that if you find yourself in a situation where the feedback is not specific, it could be as general as need to be more professional. So what's the action? What is the specific aspect? Is it coming on time to meetings? Is it having, managing the slides and the conversation well? Is it not talking on the phone while the presentation is going on? I mean, what is the specific? What is it that we want to change in order for that feedback to be useful? So I would say that it's incumbent on the receiver also to invite that, hey, the meeting got over. How do you think it went? What do you think I did well specifically? And what can I do differently? And you are inviting feedback. You're also asking for specifics, and you're asking for specifics such that they're actionable. So I would say that we can flip it around for ourselves, and it becomes relevant for us as the receiver as well. The same three things, and in fact, going out and sort of saying that, hey, as you give me your feedback, can we talk about these three things so that I can actionize, I can do something about the feedback when the next time comes. So those are the pieces that would be relevant to us as we go, right? From both the person that is giving feedback as well as the person that's receiving feedback. And I would say one other thing, right? That's something that relates to the attitude we bring in the process of receiving feedback. And let's take the story of Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck has done a lot of work on this aspect about growth mindset, right? And let's talk about the study. This is a study that was done. There was a test that was given to college students, and it was a test with about, I'd say, 40% difficulty level that people, it wasn't a very easy test. Let's put it that way. So imagine, there's a test that's being given, and everyone had like these electrodes that were connected to their heads because they were measuring what happens when a person makes a mistake, right? What is the activity in the brain when they make a mistake? And more importantly, what's the activity in the brain right after that mistake is made? What happens then? Now, interestingly enough, the folks, so, they were up, doing that questionnaire that was given to them, and they were, they used to be told when they made a mistake. So there was a set of people that when they were told that they made a mistake, they went all out to engage with that mistake. In fact, they put more energy, more attention into that mistake and improved when the next question came about. And those people had what you see on the right, the activity in red. So their brains were like engaged like nobody's business as that question came. And there were others that were told that they made a mistake and nothing happened, right? They did not engage when that mistake was, when the next question came. In fact, there was no activity in the brain. And so what she points to is this mindset about, do we believe that whatever it is that we are being presented is something that we could learn? Or do we believe that it's either we have it or not? Either I'm confident or I'm not. Either I'm good in meetings or I'm not, right? And that's the entity mindset where it is an either or. And the right side is the growth mindset where we treat everything as a skill and it's learnable that we put effort to it. And so, as the receiver of feedback, right, we all know it's constructive. And sometimes, the person who's providing feedback may not be giving it in the shape and form that we would like it to be. And yet, what do we do with it, right? When someone says, you need to make more eye contact and not read from the slides, then what does one do? Do we shut down or do we open ourselves to, okay, so what can I do differently, right? And that's the invitation to consider a mindset which allows us to look at and draw from whatever is the feedback that's coming our way as a receiver. And so really, in a nutshell, what are we saying? We're saying that there are three elements of feedback. There is this piece around around immediacy, right? So what are we noticing in the moment? And one piece that I want to amplify here as we look at this is, we can handle only one focus area at a time. So sometimes, let's say, in a meeting or a research paper that is being shared or some work that has been done that people are asking for feedback, right? Typically, or there's a lot of data behind it that we can work on one area at a time. So even though you may find that as the person who's providing the feedback, that maybe many things were not, as per what you thought they were going to be or what you were expecting it to be. But really from the person that's going to work on this feedback, giving one area, maybe the largest area which has the highest impact, giving that kind of feedback, allows people then to set it up for success to do something. So as we give the immediate feedback, consider one area versus sort of going into many areas. And the second piece is around the specific, as well as, like John Wooden would do it. It's short and it's succinct, and it is something that this person could do. So not more than 5 to 10 seconds of that input, right? So it's very brief, it's thought through, pass from your chest versus passing from the head, right? It's short and it's the person can remember it, it's memorable, right? So to that extent, it's specific. And actionable, right? Really, depends on the tenure. If you find that you have someone who's really experienced, really mature, inviting them to self-reflect is a good point, is a good place to start as to, hey, so what do you think happened, right? I saw that you were, looking more at the slides versus engaging. What do you think happened? And a lot of times, we have a hunch of, hey, actually, you're right. In that meeting, I was really looking at the slides and not making eye contact. So that could be a place to start. Or if you have something which is, someone you feel is new to an area, offering some inputs on what can they do really can serve them a long way, and offering them maybe 1 or 2 ways of doing it. And then again, being there for them as they do it the next time and noticing it in the moment and then providing it back. So really then the focus shifts from examining the past, which can't be altered, right, to moving to a way of feeding it forward, where we are looking at a future, we are looking at actions that we all can take. And going back to what Professor Bandura talks about is, fundamentally we all are aspirational, right? We all want to improve. So how do we move from proving ourselves, which is the threat response, which is the fixed mindset response, to actually improving, which is what feed forward can do for all of us. So hopefully this was something that was relevant, that you can pick something that is specific and actionable and apply it into the work that each of you are doing. And with that, I will hand it to Anushi for questions. Yeah, so Anushi, over to you. Anushi, can you hear me? Okay, so there are many questions here. How to give feedback for blue-collar employees? Prashant, I don't know if this answered your questions. Really, feedback to a blue-collar employee would be, hopefully there is a commitment of a goal that a person is probably doing. and there's some agreement of the goals. And relative to the goals, one could apply this, right? That it's immediate, it's action-oriented, it's specific.
Hi, Divya.
Hey, Anushi.
So there was some issue with the microphone.
No worries.
Thank you so much for a very elaborate session on feedback. We've had some questions on the personal chat window, and one of them was not a question exactly, but a doubt on the negativity that surrounds feedback sometimes tends to get very personal. How to give a feedback avoiding personal?
Personal, right? Yeah. I think it's a great question. I think what we react to is when the feedback becomes abstracted, right? When we say, instead of saying that you need to manage your time more, right? If we said it as you're not being professional or you're not confident. So the moment it becomes a judgment and evaluation, that is the feedback that's the hardest, right? It creates the highest defense in the other person because fundamentally we like to believe we are good and we can do things, right? So the more we can make it action oriented, the more we can say, here's the specific thing I want you to do, right? When you are presenting, raise your voice, or when you are in a meeting, sort of have different roles for the people that can manage the time. So if we can make it action oriented, if the person can relate to when they were in the meeting, that at the 10th minute this happened, and for the next time try to do this specific thing, if they can relate it to the behavior as to what they should do versus something about them as a character, right? As long as it is a skill, the more we can get towards that, it's the better we have our chances of receptivity on the other side.
The other question is, what is the ideal frequency of feedback? What is the time required for observation before providing feedback for a new joinee?
Yeah, I think great question. I'm finding in the agile DevOps world, for those of you who are are involved in projects or project management, organizations are heading towards daily stand-ups and providing inputs real time on a daily basis. I mean, that's sort of one way to look at it. But I'd say the frequency, the research points to something that happens within 24 hours, right? If some presentation happened, if there was a research paper that someone shared, providing input that, hey, I noticed you doing this, try doing this, is a better thing versus sort of continuing to observe. Because if you're observing and not, providing that benefit to the other individual, what really happens at let's say at the end of a month, if that feedback is consolidated, people have imperfect memory. They don't remember. None of us would do that. We won't be able to remember what happened 10 days ago in that presentation on the 10th of September or 10th of June, right? So, I'd say frequency would be like, if you can go to giving it right after that particular conversation and inviting that conversation, and the more real time, more aligned it could be with the individual, the better the chances are of turning it around. The other person will own it more because they'll also remember that, yeah, that's true. I remember that's what happened in that meeting. Okay, I'll do something about it.
Thank you, Divya. Our next question is something that I completely agree with and would want to have an answer. How should managers give feedback to their bosses, say in a 360-degree feedback session?
I wouldn't say I've cracked it, but here's what I do. I have a new manager for the last year or so, and I find, again, I adopt the same thing. It's very specific, which is, hey, in that meeting, I wanted to make a point and write around the slide that I was going to present, and you came in and provided that point. In future, I'd really like your support in allowing me to make the point. And if you had something to add, I'll invite your input right after. So we had this contracting thing that she and I do, and we do it in meetings as well, that if she asks me to present something, I go ahead and present it. And at the end of the presentation, as committed to her, I do ask her, hey, did you have anything to add? And then she jumps in. So in a way, so I provided it immediately. I was specific that, hey, this is a specific piece where I'm in the flow and I lose track. So that's the impact it has on me. And here's what we can do. I know you want to make a point, but since I'm presenting, let me go through it. And then I'll invite you for adding something that I didn't cover. So that's an example of how I've handled it. And it's the same principles. It's immediate, specific, and actionable.
Also adding on to that question, how do you deal with the feedback that you don't necessarily agree with?
I think, as a receiver, really so as a manager, you contract, or maybe you start with, here's what I wanted to share. As a receiver, I think we have an equal responsibility in that conversation to say that, I'll want to, review it or think about it if it's action oriented and do something about it. So, and we'll have to pick our own language around it. But I do think that sometimes as a receiver, simply because it's being said, we try to accept it. And I don't think that that is expected of us, right? If someone is giving us feedback, we have an equal responsibility to say, well, can you ground it with data? Can you be more specific or disagree that, hey, at that 10th slide, here's what I was doing. I was not doing this. So, get to a closure right there. But I'd say, watch for the specifics that are coming in, and insist on the details, insist on making sure it's grounded and it's actionable. It's not someone's perception of your being unprofessional or, not being tardy, those kind of things. I mean, those are judgments. So try to get to one notch below as to what was the action we are talking about and what didn't happen. So the more specific we are, the better the chances are of taking something in, as well as clarifying that, hey, actually, I don't agree with you, and being okay with being able to say it that way. Interestingly, Nushi, as you asked, there was another study which I was debating whether to put it or not. Is this aspect of receiving feedback also has something to do with confidence? And I do, as there's the same Harvard Business study by Zenger and Folkman. There's a reference right on the bottom of the slide. So if folks are interested, I'd encourage you to read. But this aspect about if someone is giving us feedback, I'd highly encourage it to be grounded in data and being able to say that, hey, I don't agree with it because here's the action I'm referring to. And so being confident to say it in that way, of course, keeping, the emotions at bay, etc., right? So you want to say it in the way that is specific enough, but being able to say it right back.
Yeah, honestly, I'd love to read through that theory, Divya. We can share the link of the theory and the slides with the participants as well if somebody is interested. There's another question, and I'll take one or two more after that if anybody is. Please write your questions here on the chat forum. Our next question is something I think you've already answered, but if you would want to elaborate a little more. Can feedback be upward oriented from subordinates to superiors? If so, how to do so?
Yeah, I think it's something that we all struggle with, and I think it comes from, whenever I have coached leaders, I let them know that, the equality in the relationship is critical. So, it's only hierarchically that someone is in a different place. And let's say if you're a project manager and you have a manager well, you're the expert in project management, and to that extent, you bring that expertise, and your manager is an expert in, let's say, management, and they bring their expertise. So how do we treat that conversation and go into it as that, hey, I bring in something, you bring in something, and the feedback, if we start from there, feedback is easier to provide, that, hey, I wanted to offer it. So remember, again, as a giver of feedback to our managers as well, we want it to be well-intentioned, right? We want it to come from a place of, hey, let's improve the way we work. We don't want it to be this is what is not going right, right? So the same rules then start applying to us as we share it upwards as well, right? Did we come from the right intention? Do we have specific details? Have we thought about an action that could be taken outside of that meeting? And how will we keep it intact and trust there even after that feedback is shared? And I think it's possible. I do believe that it's possible to share it, maybe taking baby steps at a time.
Thanks again, Divya. I think one of the biggest takeaways of this session has to be the word intent and the skepticism that comes with the word feedback.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's when we know, and we all have our favorite mentors or coaches or managers, and sometimes they would give us hard feedback. I was reading a study on Sachin Tendulkar, and he's talking about Achrekar, his coach. And it was not as though Achrekar only told him good things. There were also corrective things that were shared, right? And he attributes a lot of his success to the first coach he had. But really, what was the starting point for Achrekar? I mean, he was really on Sachin's side and really wanted Sachin to do all the wonderful things that he did. And at that age of, that delicate age of 14, 15, 16, at that age, for someone to give him feedback and to say, hey, that this is only going to make you improve, is really the how, right, that it is conveyed. And if the person feels that you're giving me feedback, but I know you're on my side, we all like to improve simply because we trust that person, and we know it's coming from the right place. And it's hard to teach it. You can see it in action, and you also know when someone is saying it with that heartfulness, we accept it. And if someone is not saying it, we also know it right away that they are not saying it from there. So yeah, beautifully said, Anushi.
On that note, thank you so much, Divya, for joining us today and giving us this wonderful insight. Thank you to all the participants for joining us, for your questions, for your time. And if there's anything you would like to tell us or you have a suggestion, please do write into the email ID shared in the mailers that we've sent out earlier. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Divya.
Hey, thanks very much. Thanks for having me.